Hello and welcome. This is the second video in our recently christened Masterpiece series, where we take a property discussed in one of our podcast episodes and devote more of the time and love we think it deserves. You may have noticed from the title that I don't quite consider this game to be a masterpiece. Admittedly, I'm playing fast and loose with my own criteria for what games we cover in these special videos. In fact, I almost didn't make this video to preserve the sanctity of this classic series. However, this game is too good to not get more of a spotlight than we can rightly provide in the podcast format, so here we are. Remember to like and subscribe as we pursue our goal of becoming a faceless media conglomerate. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown has become something of a contentious topic over the past year. Since its announcement trailer in June 2023, longtime fans of the series have critiqued this game to hell and back multiple times. People didn't like the anime-inspired art style. They didn't like the fact that it wasn't a 3D platformer a la The Sands of Time, and for some reason, massive fits were thrown about the song choice in the trailer.
And again, they weren't prepared for me.
While I'm not a fan of the song myself, that never bothered me because I knew that the song selection would not be a reflection of the actual in-game music. Had that been the case, I would have joined in with the crowd decrying the problem. But I feel like people are also forgetting the time that Ubisoft used Diddy Dirty Money for an Assassin's Creed trailer. And no one threw a bitch fit about that because we knew there wasn't a chance they would actually use rap music in a game set during the American Revolution. Don't worry, they don't use rap music in this game set in ancient Persia either. To make a long story long, this game was met with heavy skepticism from the offing, but I was honestly excited. What I saw was we would be getting a new Metroidvania-style action game, and this time one made with the resources of a AAA studio. If excited is the wrong word, at the very least I was curious, and it's my true pleasure to report that not only is this game good, it's actually pretty great. In my opinion, it's nearly a masterpiece. Nearly. I have to hold my hands up and admit that this is my first Prince of Persia game. I didn't grow up on the Sands of Time trilogy, so I'll admit I'm no expert on whether or not this feels like a classic Prince of Persia title. However, I have played one or two Metroidvanias in my time. In fact, in the wake of games like Ori and the Blind Forest, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Hollow Knight, and Metroid Dread, the modern Metroidvania has become my favorite genre. Prince of Persia thankfully implements things I loved from each and every one of these modern genre classics. The first example is the parry system, and the sense of spectacle present in Metroid Dread. The combat is fast and intense like in Dread, but I would argue it's actually better in The Lost Crown. The swordplay is nuanced enough to encourage the player to find the style that works best for them. In Dread, the strategy is almost always to react defensively to what your opponent does, because if you get too aggressive, you get f***ed up. In The Lost Crown, you have more options. If you want to play defensively, you are rewarded for that with opportunities to parry and counter. In Dread, the only parryable attacks are telegraphed with a yellow flash that allows for an insta-kill follow-up on normal enemies, or a cutscene in which the player can deal massive damage to a boss. These are heavily stylized and so satisfying to pull off in Dread, and the golden parries are just as satisfying in The Lost Crown. I mean, I'm not much of an anime fan, but even I have to admit, some of these are cool as hell. But apart from those yellow flash parry opportunities, the player has the option to parry almost any other attack in the game as well, allowing for a defense and counter style approach that I have not seen fleshed out so well in a Metroidvania. You also have access to something called Athra in this game, which builds as you successfully parry/land attacks, and once charged, these allow Sargon to perform an unblockable power move complete with a cute little anime-inspired cutscene, akin to the yellow parry finishers. You can assign up to 2 Athra charges at a time, and the differences in what they do combined with the amount of meter required for each added a surprising amount of variance, and I had to think pretty carefully about which ones I wanted to equip, especially in some of the latter boss fights. If you are like me though, and always find offense to be the best defense, Prince of Persia has you covered here too, encouraging Devil May Cry-esque combos that lift enemies into the air to keep them immobilized for as long as possible, before smashing them to the ground again and following up with ranged attacks to keep your damage up. The time powers you acquire throughout the game can also add nuance into your battle strategy. A personal favorite move of mine was to save a shade of myself in the air to keep handy for a quick getaway, or to dispatch death from above to a cowardly enemy who had retreated from my reach. From Hollow Knight, the Lost Crown borrows the charm system, which also has a huge bearing on the way you fight. Here the charms are called amulets, but they work the exact same as in Hollow Knight, offering modifications to your melee or ranged attacks, or buffing various passive abilities. When I unlocked the amulet that enables you to spin your boomerang like chakram in place to deal sustained area damage, my regular enemy fight strategy was never the same. You can even parry the chakram as it returns to you and trigger the area effect again to become a ranged damage monster. Pair strategies like this up with the time powers, and you have a seemingly endless well of opportunity in tuning your combat style to your liking. This game combines its elements in a way that made the combat endlessly enjoyable for me. You should never feel like you were cheap-shotted in a game like this, and the amount of defensive, melee, and ranged options at my disposal made me feel like I always stood a fighting chance. I just needed to tweak my strategy. I frequently forgot to upgrade my weapons until after I beat whatever boss I was working on, because they make you feel so damn powerful from the jump, or at the very least, they give you options. Speaking of which, the boss battles are also a huge highlight. Almost all of them are pretty epic. I won't spoil too many of them here, but the thrill of evading death blows only to counter with an anime cutscene of my own was always satisfying. In the last section, I compared the great combat in Metroid Dread to the combat in this game to highlight the extremely strong implementation that the Lost Crown pulls off. In this section, I want to compare the platforming in the Lost Crown to the game that I consider to be the greatest modern example of a perfected movement system, Ori and the Will of the Wisps. By the end of the second Ori game, the player has unlocked a myriad of movement abilities that allow them to positively fly through the beautifully crafted world, creating a sense of true agility and freedom. That's what I loved most about the Ori games, and since my first playthrough of those games, movement fluidity has always felt more like a genre staple to me than an added bonus. So how does the Lost Crown compare here? While I don't think it reaches quite the same heights as some of the sequences in the Ori games, it is extremely satisfying in the Lost Crown. In typical Metroidvania fashion, the player slowly builds up their arsenal of abilities that add depth to their traversal. Abilities such as saving a fractured shade of yourself in one spot so you can teleport to it when needed, or the ability to capture an object, enemy projectile, or even enemy proper to be used in a key location later. Or how about a lasso that can pull the player to new vantage points or even towards enemies? These powers are endlessly fun to experiment with and make for some really creative puzzle solutions as well. By the way, I didn't list all of them here because I don't want to spoil anything, but some of them are really cool. But the star of the show for me here are the platforming challenges. Some of the platforming challenges require near pixel perfect precision, but thankfully don't punish you too much for messing up. They will require you to put your powers of concentration and dexterity to use time after time until you develop the perfect sequence of button pushes to navigate a maze of spikes and other obstacles. Taking a hit will simply teleport you back to the beginning of the challenge, so it never feels frustrating to fail, and the sense of relief and accomplishment after successfully navigating a particularly hairy area is palpable here. If you do find yourself getting frustrated, there are a variety of difficulty settings as well as more specified settings that the player can tweak to make the game easier. If you're worried that this game sounds too hard for you, please give it a try, as it is one of the most accessible and personalizable Metroidvanias I've ever seen. Your movement options may not make you feel quite as nimble as Ori, but the wealth of puzzles, lovingly crafted platforming sections will leave you feeling more than satisfied.
Well, you always left me satisfied and smiling, so...
This game is a surprise to me because I kept hearing that the story for this game was nothing special, with some reviewers I watch even labeling it as forgettable. While I agree that it won't win any awards, I found myself very pleasantly surprised with how engaged I was in what was happening. If you haven't heard anything about this game's story, you play as Sargon, aka not the Prince of Persia, which is another thing that people were upset about, by the way. A member of an elite band of Persian warriors called the Immortals. It's clear from the beginning that Sargon is the new kid on the block. He has not earned the full trust of each member of the Immortals yet. At a certain point, the prince is kidnapped and spirited away to the mysterious Mount Kof, where a curse has altered the flow of time. The Immortals deploy to Mount Kof to rescue him, and during the mission, Sargon is framed and must battle through enemies, monsters, and overcome the members of the Immortals who do not trust him in order to save the day. I really loved the development of Sargon's relationships with his comrades in this game, especially between him and the members of the Immortals you have to fight. I also enjoyed the twists and turns the story took along the way. I was particularly surprised by some big reveals near the end. Admittedly, I had near rock bottom expectations for the story, and the fact that it ended up being much more engaging than I thought might make me a little biased here, so I'll reiterate, don't expect a Red Dead Redemption 2. But if I could take the liberty of comparing The Lost Crown to Metroid Dread again, I think the story worked much better for me here. It's easy to follow, and despite its inherently twisty nature, it manages to stay mostly tight and focused, without assuming that the player has played other previous Prince of Persia titles. I'm putting it in the plus column, sue me.
Would become a legend.
So what don't you want?
Pardon?
There's really not much to complain about. Most of my non-fixable issues with the game have to do completely with my personal preferences and some perhaps unfair expectations. The first and littlest of gripes that I have is with the soundtrack. By no means is it bad, and sometimes it sounds really awesome, particularly during some of the boss fights and in the main title sequence. But the composer, Gareth, is also the composer for the two Ori games, which boast my favorite soundtracks in all of video games. I think I was expecting something like that here, and Coker went for a much more subdued, almost ambient style soundtrack. Again, it's not bad, and sometimes it's really good, it just suffers by comparison with some of his other work. The second issue I had was I felt the art style hindered the impact of the cutscenes at times. It's, as previously stated, heavily inspired by anime, and at times there's some really suspect lip syncing that took me out of the experience, in true anime English dub fashion. This is a real shame because the game often does an excellent job at setting the stage for an epic confrontation, only to somewhat ruin it with a couple seconds of goofy looking character animation.
None of you will leave here alive.
The Russia bar, was it? Your life ends here.
Not if yours ends first.
Another issue I had with this game was its performance. I played on Nintendo Switch, and 90+% of the experience was pretty flawless, but that last 10-ish% was home to some nasty bugs. I could not play more than a few of the combat challenges in a row without the game completely crashing, and I did notice some significant frame drops upon entering some of the game's areas. These usually smooth out after a couple of seconds, but they were still noticeable. But maybe my most frustrating bug occurred after I got my ass handed to me a couple of times fighting the third to last boss. I decided to respawn at the nearest save point to modify my amulets and Athra surges, and after re-entering the arena, the game would crash without fail until I changed my character skin back to the default. I would never have discovered this bug if it were not for the good people of Reddit. I know these bugs will get fixed at some point in the game's lifetime, but I felt I struggled with enough of them that I had to say something about it here. I would say if you have no other way to play the game, the Switch version works mostly really well, but be aware that you will probably experience a bug or two. If you have the option of picking this up on PC, Xbox, or PlayStation, just do that. It's honestly a good rule of thumb anyway for non-Switch exclusives. I just have a weird desire to play every Metroidvania on a portable system, even though I played most of this game exclusively in dock mode. Barring a couple of nitpicks regarding some of the stylistic choices and some irritating bugs, this game is a huge step in the right direction for Ubisoft. It succeeds in almost everything it sets out to do with flying colors. This is more proof to me that Ubisoft have some talented and passionate developers under their corporate umbrella. Developers that are more than capable of making a great game when they're allowed to be free to build what they want. I would strongly recommend giving this one a try if you have ever enjoyed Metroidvanias, platformers, action games, or if you simply want to send Ubisoft the message that there is still a market for games that aren't called Assassin's Creed or Far Cry. The Lost Crown boasts an incredibly strong combat system, the strongest I've seen in a Metroidvania, a fun and unique set of abilities, a wealth of excellent puzzle and platforming sections, and an interesting story that will keep you occupied for around 20 hours on the first playthrough. Be a winner and play this game.